very strange, almost haunted house.
In Worthing, a reclusive widow is savagely beaten, then left for dead.
It was like something out of a horror movie.
Nobody had the right to take that life from her. He was a cold, calculating killer.
And if we're talking psychopath, we're talking no sense of guilt.
It was going to be a very difficult case to solve.
Not even murder can keep a killer away from his crime scene.
We had no motive here.
Somebody had written that note to cover up the murder.
A missing persons report leads police to a derelict house on Tennyson Road.
The garden was completely unkept and overgrown, and you had to walk up a path, and there were bushes that you had to move to get into the front door.
They're looking for an 87-year-old woman named Jean Barnes. She lives alone and hasn't answered her phone for days.
It was a semi-detached Victorian house. It was huge. The house looked very neglected and sad. It was a jungle. There were trees that were 20 feet tall and 20 feet deep, and it was a real struggle just to get into the house.
She was obviously a hoarder. The house was really in quite a nasty mess.
There were rooms, ceiling to the floor, of newspapers and discarded items.
They found Miss Barnes' body. She'd been covered by a blanket, and she was dead.
At 10:30 that night, Steve Scott arrives. He takes over as the lead investigator.
My role at the time was that of a senior detective, and I was on call to go to any suspicious death, any unexplained death.
Removing the blanket raises immediate questions.
Yes, she may have fallen down the stairs, but that was unlikely. Yes, she may have fallen over and banged her head, but that also was unlikely.
Until pathologists can investigate the crime scene, the death of Jean Barnes is a puzzling mystery.
What I wanted was the scene controlled and secured until daytime. I wanted Miss Barnes' body left there to give the pathologist an opportunity to view how the body was and how the scene was. I spoke to the detective chief inspector in the town. I said, I think this is murder.
Due to the strange nature of the case, more help is requested. Chief Inspector Martin Underhill joins the investigation team.
It was an incredible scene. I've never seen a scene like it. I've worked on 40-odd murders. This was probably, arguably, the most complicated scene that I've dealt with. Clearly had not been looked after for 20 or 30 years. There were cobwebs everywhere. The walls were filthy dirty. There was no carpet on the floor. It's just bare floorboards. And everywhere was newspapers.
There are no signs of forced entry. No scratches on doors or windows. Detectives Scott and Underhill focus on the most compelling evidence.
There was blood at the bottom of the stairs, and there was blood at the door leading into the downstairs bedroom.
The pathologist confirms what Scott suspected the night before.
The injury to her head was very severe. It looked as if she'd been attacked around the head a number of times.
The location of her wounds immediately suggests how Miss Barnes was killed.
A number of blows had been rained down upon her head, with someone standing up and her being lower down.
It's likely she was attacked in the hallway, dragged into the bedroom, then hit repeatedly. As police prepare to remove the body, their first piece of evidence surfaces. It's a note the night duty officer had received just hours before.
One of the first people that approached the police in the early hours of that morning after the body had been discovered was the milkman. He told police that he had a note which he had taken from the doorstep, and it said that she was going into a nursing home.
Dear milkman, I'm sorry, but I'm going into hospital on Monday, 26th of July. Then I'll be going into a nursing home. Therefore, could you please leave me the bill after Friday 23rd and a loaf today? Thanks for your kindness, Jean Barnes.
The milkman tells police he found the note a week ago. 3 days later, Barnes's last bill was paid by check. It suggests the victim died within the last 72 hours. It also raises other questions crucial to the investigation.
Was she going into a nursing home? Where was it? Why was she going in? For us, this was important.
The police need answers, and fast, if they hope to catch a killer. They have no obvious motive, no substantial evidence. Whoever murdered Jean Barnes is out there, and free to strike again. A reclusive woman has been murdered in her home. So far, police have no suspects and no motive. But they do know the victim was reported missing by a neighbor, a woman named Hilda Wolven.
Miss Barnes had an elderly friend that lived opposite. The elderly friend was blind, so they would phone each other, and Miss Barnes would read the newspaper on the phone.
Wolven explains to police how calls to her friend's house had gone unanswered.
She thought that was strange because Miss Barnes was reclusive and never went out, so she contacted the police.
When they tell her about the note turned in by the milkman, she doesn't believe it.
She told the police that she was so friendly with her that she would have known, and Miss Barnes had not mentioned anything at all about going into a nursing home.
Why would Barnes hide something like that from a friend?
Murders are like jigsaw puzzles, and so are the victims. You have to piece together their life.
After talking to other neighbors, police begin to build a profile of Barnes. They learn she had become increasingly isolated.
Most people saw her come out of the house once a week when she would walk down the middle of the road with her basket to do her shopping. And that was it.
She may have been seen in her garden, but very infrequently. She was reclusive and really stayed in the house completely.
Detectives also discover the murdered woman has only one living relative, a nephew named Jeremy Wynn. They need to speak to him as soon as possible. Wynn is tracked 125 miles from the crime scene to Dorset, where he lives with his wife Maureen.
I was met at the door by policemen. I was quite surprised. I invited him in, and he told me what had happened.
My name's Chris Wyeth.
Officer Chris Wyeth is assigned to deliver the news to Barnes' relatives.
It was my first murder inquiry. I was looking to become a detective, so I wanted to, I won't say try and prove myself, but get as much experience as I could.
I started shaking. I couldn't stop.
Came back from work, and my wife informed me that the police had been round.
We both were very, very upset.
The news of his aunt's death is shocking. But for Jeremy Wynn, the situation is about to get much worse.
Everything was very cold and curt.
You know that you haven't done anything wrong, and you wonder how to choose the words so that you can prove that.
I believe I was a suspect. I had the feeling I was a suspect.
What's your relationship with
Most murders are committed by people in the family.
The interrogation goes on for several hours. Then suddenly, the mood changes.
I presume when they questioned me, or my answers, or the way I looked at them, they changed their minds. But there was definitely a big change at around 4 o'clock of that day.
He was very well alibied at work and at home with his wife and his employer.
Wynn now paints an extraordinary picture of his aunt for detectives. One completely at odds with the profile of a lonely hermit.
My aunt was a brilliant intellectual. She had a photographic memory. She was one of the first women to go to Cambridge. She worked as a translator in the Foreign Office. She spoke 6 languages fluently.
She would serve her country for the Secret Service during the war, so patriotically. Suddenly, behind the body, behind the murder, I had a vibrant, beautiful woman.
Over 50 years ago, Barnes suffered a heartbreaking loss with the death of her fiancée. A fighter pilot killed in action during the Battle of Britain.
So she was obviously a very talented, very capable lady whose life just stopped because her fiancé was killed. Once he'd died, she could see no reason to have any other partner, and when she was killed, she was wearing a gold band on her wedding finger.
Living alone in the house she inherited from her parents, the Cambridge graduate became a recluse. When asked about the milkman's note and its suggestion that Barnes was about to move to a nursing home, the Wynns are skeptical.
We knew she would never enter a nursing home or a residential home. She was just not that type of individual.
If the victim hadn't written the note, who had?
So the note was telling a lie. And why would she tell a lie?
We suddenly thought, this is not a genuine note. This is someone trying to lay a smokescreen.
The case has taken a sudden twist. Police suspect the killer may have tried to cover his tracks by forging a note. To confirm it, they recover other handwriting samples from the crime scene.
We had handwriting from Miss Barnes in the house.
They sent all the materials to handwriting expert Kim Hughes.
It's a fairly slow process because you have to look at the fine detail of all the letters that you have in a signature or in a question note. The types of things that we do when we make these comparisons is perhaps initially just look at shapes of letters, letter designs in the questions and the specimen handwriting to see if they correspond or if they don't correspond.
As Hughes gets to work, the forensic team continues searching the house.
It's done slowly, methodically, and thoroughly to make sure that nothing is missed.
we submitted hundreds of items to the laboratory. There were thousands and thousands of exhibits.
The stacks of newspapers alone date back almost 40 years.
Normally you can examine a murder scene in a normal house in 3 or 4 days. I knew this was going to take 3 or 4 weeks. We had no motive here. And without a motive, it's really hard to find your lines of inquiry.
She had obviously been living a reclusive life, and straight away we realised that if she lived alone and she was a recluse, that it was going to be a very difficult case to solve.
The lack of motive remains a big stumbling block. But at least now, the initial post-mortem results are in.
The pathologist said that it was probably a blunt, heavy instrument. She'd had 9 or 10 heavy blows around the head.
The injury to her head was massive. This wasn't an accidental fall. Someone had staved her skull in. It's one of the worst head injuries I've seen.
Narrowing down the time of death is vital, and the post-mortem has turned up an important clue that could help determine when the killer struck.
But there were some maggots and flies that had infested the body.
Flies are fascinating creatures because they produce maggots which destroy rotting carcasses. They also help us time the time of death because each generation of maggot takes a certain cycle of days to be born. They were killed in alcohol and then sent off for examination.
The evidence so far indicates Barnes had been dead at least 3 days. It substantiates reports from neighbours and the suspect note from the milkman. But the date can't be confirmed until the lab report on the insects is complete. Six days after the body of Jean Barnes was discovered, there are still no suspects and no clues as to why she was killed.
We wanted to know anybody and everybody that had been in that street in the preceding 7 days. So we made appeals through local media and also national media.
As they wait and hope for help from the public, the police also search their own records for anything that might relate to the murder. They make a startling find.
Jean Barnes had phoned the police numerous times in the last year. She was complaining that someone was stealing from her house.
Finally, the first sign of a possible motive. Police had investigated her complaints about missing antiques and paintings.
We started finding dust marks on walls and dust marks on cabinets or tables where obviously something had been stored and then moved, and the dust marks showed the shape of the item that had gone.
But in the immense clutter of the house, there was no way to tell if anything had actually been taken.
Because she was elderly, because she was reclusive, because she was extremely irritable, the police didn't take the call seriously.
It's now painfully clear. Barnes was right to be concerned.
She knew something was going on, but it wasn't being pieced together.
Then, the ongoing search of the house leads to another discovery.
We found a writing cabinet which had various letters and discharge papers for her relatives.
The cabinet holds Jean's financial records. What they divulge is stunning.
She was worth well in excess of £500,000.
I was flabbergasted. This lady lived on £3 a week. Suddenly we had a motive. Suddenly we realised that our motive might be theft.
This revelation leads detectives straight back to Jean's nephew, Jeremy Wynne.
Good afternoon.
It occurs that Wynne or others may have known of his aunt's wealth and involved themselves in murder to get it.
What we wanted to know was, did somebody else know that? And is that why they had decided to target her?
The £500,000 fortune. We were very shocked at the time.
And their shock seems genuine.
When I found out, I was surprised.
He had no idea his aunt was a wealthy woman.
Wynne family weren't aware of the money either. Nobody seemed to be aware of how much money she had.
But somebody knew her house was worth robbing. They knew how to get in, and it appears they knew how to get away with it. The police investigation has been underway for 6 weeks. Hope of finding Jean Barnes' killer is starting to fade.
I did not think they were going to catch anybody, and this worried me.
We didn't hold out a great deal of hope, I must confess. We did feel that perhaps it would take a very long time before someone was caught.
Desperate for a break in the case, police return to their files. They uncover another complaint made by Jean Barnes, but they finally point a finger at her elusive murderer. Months before she was slain, Barnes reported a suspicious phone call from a man claiming to be a bank official. He wanted details of her account, and though she refused to give any, 2 credit cards later arrived in the mail.
Somebody had applied for 2 credit cards in her name, hoping that they could intercept the postman before the credit cards arrived at the house.
But Barnes got them first.
We had 2 credit card applications. We applied to the bank and they still had them on microfiche.
The bank provides 2 other key pieces of evidence. A check left for the milkman to pay for the final delivery, and a second check sent to the local electricity company.
The electricity company had sent her a bill which had been paid. We sent that to the handwriting expert.
The same person had signed the cheques and the note. I was very confident that whoever had written out the cheques had also written out the applications for the credit cards.
But that person was not Jean Barnes.
The handwritings were quite different. One simple example, in the signature of Jean Barnes, she used to write the letter J with just 1 stroke of the pen. But the signatures on the notes had a letter J that was written with 2 separate strokes of the pen.
Although police find no usable fingerprints on any of the forged documents, they're convinced they now have the next best thing: the killer's handwriting. But what they still don't have is his identity.
Clearly, the murderer had not wanted anybody to come round and disconnect her from the electricity for not paying the bill.
We had theft of antiques and someone who was financially targeting Jean Barnes.
There was a torn envelope on the table in that kitchen. When you took that torn envelope from the inside of the house and married it up with the letter that had been left to the milkman, it was an exact match. The envelope in the kitchen was indeed the envelope that the electricity bill had come in.
It can only mean one thing.
Whoever wrote that note was actually inside the house when they wrote it.
The evidence is chilling. Jean Barnes' killer had unrestricted access to her home, free to steal, defraud, then ultimately murder when he pleased.
We realised that we had someone targeting Jean Barnes over a prolonged period of time.
And until police can track him down, the killer is free to choose more victims. It's been 2 months since Jean Barnes was murdered. Money is the motive, but police still have no suspects. Until, finally, they get a tip from the public.
A number of people called the local police to say that there'd been a confidence trickster, a con man, operating in the town. He was using a scam to say that he'd broken down and could he be lent £25, which would get him home.
We put that MO into the computer, only one name came back. This man travelled across the county, ripping off members of the public.
His name? Raymond Price. Could this be the man who attacked Jean Barnes? Did he commit murder, then forge documents to keep stealing from his victim? Worthing police now join several other forces in a nationwide hunt for Raymond Price.
He would just literally keep moving. He had no roots, he had no family or friends.
At the same time, another suspect is emerging, a man named Robert Smith.
He was a drug addict that lived in the town. He had committed a burglary in the same street. He'd used a coat hanger to go through the letterbox to slip the front door.
This technique leaves no visible signs of entry, as was the case at the Barnes house. After weeks of nothing, detectives now have two solid leads. While hot on the trail of conman Raymond Price, they track Smith down and bring him in for questioning.
We arrested him. We took him to a local police station.
The killer police have been seeking may be sitting across the table from them, and they've got a new piece of evidence that will prove it. A shoe print.
It was on the second floor of the house, on the lino, in the dust. It was clearly a large shoe, not one of Miss Barnes.
Police take Smith's shoes for testing and get a sample of his handwriting. If they match, the case will have broken open. A theory emerges that Robert Smith, drug addict, saw Mrs. Barnes in the area and knew she was vulnerable. His coat hanger gained him invisible entry into the house. His habit drove him back, stealing whenever he needed money. Until the night Barnes confronted him. It's a solid possibility. But when the test results come back, the case crumbles.
The shoe pattern wasn't a match.
Worse, neither is the handwriting sample. Police have no option but to release Smith. Hopes dashed. They now focus entirely on the remaining suspect, Raymond Price. But they have to find him first. Police launch an all-out effort to track down the #1 suspect in the murder of wealthy recluse Jean Barnes.
This is Raymond Price, and he's shown here coming out of Worthing Station in Sussex on a Saturday in July.
We went on the National Crime Watch programme to make an appeal. We wanted people to tell us where he was.
Worthing was murdered. If you see him, don't lend him money.
40 calls come in, but none lead to Price. Again, it seems the trail's gone cold. Then, an unexpected breakthrough.
2 days later, he gave himself up. He saw the programme.
A 6-week manhunt ends. Price is arrested on suspicion of murder. The shoes are confiscated and handwriting samples ordered.
He fully admitted being in that road, admitted the offences he committed, but denied ever meeting Jean Barnes or ever been to the house.
Police suspect otherwise.
He'd been in the road at the key time, had he seen anybody, but as importantly, what was he doing outside Miss Barnes' house?
But detectives can't get a confession from Price. And there is worse news. His shoe print doesn't match. Nor does his handwriting.
I found several differences between the handwriting of this confidence trickster and the question documents, but two that spring to mind are, on the question documents, the letter A starts with no significant downstroke. It starts from the bottom and goes upwards, whereas in the specimen writing there was a very tall initial downstroke in the capital letter A. I was able to report back to the officers in the case that I thought that he was not the person responsible.
Police are forced to release Price. More than 2 months after the murder, they once again have no suspects. And the bad news keeps on coming. Jean Barnes' final post-mortem report has a shocking revelation. Due to unusually cool temperatures in her house, the gestation period of the insects found on her body was longer than first believed.
We then found out that death occurred 2 to 3 weeks before her body had been recovered.
Time of death is one of the most important clues in any investigation. For 2.5 months, police have been trying to solve the case with faulty information. Barnes lay dead not for days, but for weeks.
The local TV newspaper was opened on a date on the 12th. There were eggs, milk and bread in the house, dated the same date, tied in with what we were being told by the entomologist.
It's a disturbing revelation. While the killer continued to rob her house, Jean Barnes lay lifeless on the floor for at least 14 days.
Somebody had been going in and out of the house after the murder had occurred. We needed to know who that was.
The new timeline completely exonerates the drug addict, Robert Smith, who was in jail at the time of the murder. It also sends police into the neighborhood again, redoing hundreds of interviews based on the new information.
A lot of our house-to-house inquiries, a lot of our media appeals have been based on people in the road in the 7 days leading up to the police becoming involved.
With the trail going cold, investigators reach outside the department. They call in renowned criminal profiler, Dr. Julian Boone.
My job was to come in and simply look at it from a different, not better, different perspective, from a psychological perspective.
Boone tries to put himself inside the mind of the killer.
It became clear he would have some prior knowledge of the victim and she of he. He would have known in advance that the victim was perfect for the scam that he was trying to enact. The thing that stands out first and foremost here is the extreme callousness. She was seen simply as an impediment to him getting the articles from the house for his own personal gain. Sheer psychopathy. And if we're talking psychopath, we're talking no sense of guilt. And if we're talking no sense of guilt and this extreme, it will have happened before. We'd be very strongly looking for someone with previous convictions or a previous history of fraud, embezzlement, crimes such as these.
Julian suggested that it would possibly be somebody that could walk down the street without looking suspicious, somebody that should be in the street.
Remarkably, key elements of Boone's profile fit someone police had already talked to. A man who knows the neighborhood. A man who knew Barnes and could easily access her home without raising suspicion. The milkman.
We found a lot of our leads were leading back to the milkman.
We needed to talk to him to establish his movements.
He was giving us a lot of evidence. He gave us the note. He was involved in the check.
The milkman is asked for an alibi to cover the revised time of death.
We found some discrepancies we weren't happy with. He had some dishonesty in the past.
He had also been sick or not done the duty on the day after the murder.
We found a Christmas card from the murder victim in his house. We thought it unusual that he had over 300 customers, and yet only one was found in his house.
A handwriting sample could be all the police need to finally catch their killer. They are certain Kim Hughes can prove the milkman's writing matches the forged documents. But they're in for another major disappointment.
I found that they differed, and I was confident that he was not the writer of the questioned documents.
Like the con man and the drug addict, there was handwriting which didn't match. There were shoe patterns which didn't match.
It became apparent that he wasn't the person who killed Jean Barnes.
The milkman, like the others, walks free.
Every time we found one door that opened, another door shut. We just couldn't find the pieces of the jigsaw.
Once again, the investigation is in limbo. It's now 3 months since the murder, and Detective Scott is under enormous pressure to get results.
Last month, we asked for information on the murder of the 87-year-old Jean Barnes, who was bludgeoned...
By now, they've conducted 900 interviews, made extensive media appeals, and forensically examined the Barnes house for 9 weeks.
We had seized over 2,000 exhibits. The investigation cost £750,000 if you include all the salaries and forensic submissions. Over 210 police officers and staff involved.
Backs against the wall, lead investigators call an all-hands brainstorming session.
I said to the team, come on, let's dig deep. Someone here must have an idea. Chris Wyeth put his hand up very nervously and said, I've got an idea, sir. Why don't we put the handwriting on Crime Watch? Why don't we put the handwriting on TV and see if someone recognises it? And that was a new door that we'd opened, and I was very excited by that. And I thought this might help solve the murder.
Police detailed the killer's handwriting on their second Crime Watch appearance, as well as the local 6 o'clock news.
Some of the details.
Yes, on the Alliance and Leicester application, for example, it asked for Miss Barnes' mother's name. We had over 200 responses.
Julian Boone evaluates the calls, paying closer attention to those that best fit his profile of the killer. One astonishing story emerges. A woman named Audrey Ridpath claims to know exactly whose writing it is. She's seen this forger's handiwork before.
When I saw the letter, I just rang the police and told them where they'd find the other false one. It's like it. You'll find it at the Westminster Bank, one almost the same. And it's a man named David Munley.
David Munley is a local handyman. Ridpath had hired him 4 years ago, then referred him to her elderly neighbour.
He went in there and he worked there very well for a while. And then, of course, he started stealing things.
The elderly neighbour had suffered some thefts, but also, significantly, 3 cheques had been stolen and forged.
Ridpath visited the bank on behalf of her neighbour.
And they said, yes, got a letter saying that she'd gone into a nursing home.
We'd seen that before. We'd seen that on the letter left for the milkman.
And a name that appears in the neighbour's letters raises even more red flags.
Please allow my nephew, David Armstrong, to cash these 3 checks.
But it's an alias. David Armstrong is David Munley.
Even to an untrained eye, this was similar handwriting.
Hoping they finally got their man, police rushed the handwriting samples to Kim Hughes. But they've been down this road before. Is David Munley a cold-blooded killer? Or another innocent suspect? After 4 months of investigation, police may have finally uncovered the killer of Jean Barnes.
This was a con man who was targeting elderly ladies, and because of his previous convictions, we realised that this man didn't just fit the profile of the profiler, he also had motive, opportunity.
Authorities act quickly, moving in on David Munley at his home.
We found him living 240 yards from Miss Barnes's house.
Everything about him was medium, average. He was just an average 50-odd-year-old man. He was just coming to from his sleep. I shook him on the shoulder and I said to him, "I'm arresting you for the murder of Jean Barnes."
He's taken into custody, but police need more.
We knew when we went into David Munley's house, we needed to recover handwriting.
The search ends in failure. Not one scrap of handwriting is found.
It was almost as if he knew we were coming.
Unfazed by his arrest, Munley denies knowing Jean Barnes. Within his rights, he refuses to give a writing sample. Detectives are nervous. The case against their suspect remains hearsay, lacking hard evidence and irrefutable proof. Munley walks free in 3 days, unless they find something in his flat that conclusively links him to the crime.
There were some wooden floorboards in an understairs cupboard. The search team, being thorough, lifted the floorboards.
They lifted the floorboard up, and underneath is Pandora's box.
When they looked into the void between the joists of the floor, they could see a number of items.
There were some 20 cigarette ends and a couple of candlesticks.
And there's one more item that connects him to the victim.
Jean Barnes' civil service membership card.
Like trophies, which had been stored away. And I was astounded, absolutely astounded.
It's a stunning breakthrough.
I knew that it linked 100% David Munley with Jean Barnes.
When these facts were put to David Munley in interview, he changed and went no comment. He knew that his lies had caught him out.
Soon, word comes in from writing expert Kim Hughes. His comparison of the other forgeries further strengthens their case.
There was very strong evidence that he was the writer. I was happy that they were written by the same person.
Munley's shoes are also matched to the print found in Barnes' house. Police now believe they know how Jean Barnes became Munley's victim. He's a failed businessman, deeply in debt. To make ends meet, he began working as a handyman.
She contacted him and he started to work on the building, and he obviously noticed that beneath the dust, some of the antiques looked quite valuable.
Having regular access to Jean's house, Munley could easily have stolen a key.
He then returned to the house on a number of occasions to steal from her.
As well as making off with the vulnerable widow's possessions, Munley also attempted to rob her by credit card fraud.
My name is David Armstrong from Midtown Bank.
He was able to steal at will, until Jean stumbled into a fateful confrontation. Not bothering to dispose of the body, Munley took a trophy of his deed, stashing it in his hiding place. He then raided Jean's house for at least 14 nights, buying time to rob the dead woman with the milkman note and check, as well as the check to the electric company. Two days after his arrest, police charged David Munley with murder. Soon after, a flood of condemning evidence emerges.
His DNA was on those cigarette ends.
His DNA is also found on a used tissue recovered from Barnes' house. He's tied forensically to both locations. Later, Barnes' nephew recognizes his aunt's property when police show him pictures of items turned in by antique dealers.
When they saw Munley on the media coverage, they realized where the antiques had come from and immediately contacted the police.
David Munley is convicted and sentenced to life behind bars. He doesn't appeal, but never admits to killing Jean Barnes.
I was affected by the great service she did to this country and the fact that she became a recluse and no one knew who she was. And actually she had some fantastic stories to tell, but there was no one there to hear them. So I thought it was an awful end to an interesting life.
I felt very badly about the fact that I didn't force myself to go to my aunt for 6 months before the murder happened. It's This upset me throughout the case. But I feel guilty.